Well, good morning, everybody. I am glad to see you here this morning. Good to see you online, and hope you had a great week. We are ready to get started. So let me uh, let me simply tell you that if you haven't answered our poll question yet, please take a moment to do so before the end of the broadcast. We'd like to have your opinion on that. It's going to be a couple more weeks before we start meeting live, but we'd like to get your input as to what time frame we meet, when we go back to meeting in person. Now, our plan right now is to continue to broadcast live even after we begin to meet in person. So we're going to continue these broadcasts, and it'll have a little different format, I'm sure, because I'll be standing at the front of the church instead of sitting at my desk in my office at OBU. But that's the plan right now. So let's. By the way, I think everybody knows I made an announcement on Facebook. I made an announcement to our church during prayer meeting the other night. I have resigned at OBU effective May 31 and taken a position with the Oklahoma Baptist or the Baptist Foundation of Oklahoma. Excuse me, I better get the name right if I'm going to work for them. But the Baptist Foundation of Oklahoma, I'll be starting to work for them on June the 1st. And so excited about that, but sad to be leaving OBU. I've been here 31 years. May 31 will actually end exactly 31 years. I started on June the 1st in 1989, and I will end my career here on May 31st, 2020. So 31 years total. And but I am sad to leave. A lot of good memories, a lot of things we've been able to accomplish, but looking forward to what we can do at the Baptist Foundation. So let's get started. Let me share with you that we're going to be back in our passage in Acts chapter 27 this morning. We're going to be looking at verses 39 through 44. We've been building up to this moment because the story has been building towards a shipwreck, and this morning we're actually going to take a look at the actual shipwreck, what happened. All right, so let's read a little bit here. So when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach, and they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After casting off the anchors, those are the anchors that they had put on the stern to stop them. So after casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. But the centurion, and you'll remember his name was Julius, but the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. So he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. So it's a it's one of those classic stories of a shipwreck, and I can tell you, I noticed a little earlier my older brother has joined the broadcast, and he actually lives on the island of Sicily. The shipwreck that we're talking about actually occurred on the island of Malta, which is just south of Sicily, of the island of Sicily. And so Paul had been on a ship, a grain ship, bound for Rome. And these ships could be quite large. And as you can imagine, 200, I think it said 276 passengers on board. That would include the crew and so forth, but 276 people on board the ship. So a fairly large ship, and full of grain. And they had begun to be tossed by this storm. It had raged for days, actually weeks. And they were driven to the southwest. So they were driven out of the Adriatic, and they were driven to the southwest, and they ended up near the island of Malta. Now, I will tell you, on Malta there is a place called St. Paul's Bay, um, and so that is where it's believed that the shipwreck may have occurred. There doesn't appear to be any longer a sandy beach, although I can tell you that the shorelines change over a period of time, and 2,000 years is a long time, so those shorelines would have changed. But as they had loosed the anchors and hoisted the foresail and tried to make for land to run the ship aground, they hit a sandbar, and the ship began to be beaten from the waves and broken apart. And so we want to talk about that this morning. All right, so that we're not going to talk. We're going to talk about a shipwreck, but not so much a literal shipwreck as much as a if you will, a shipwreck of our lives. We tend to get ourselves in messes, don't we? All right. So what I want to do this morning is start by talking about living life with a purpose. That's what what I've titled the sermon. So living life with a purpose. I want to talk about that a little bit. So let me ask you a question. Do you have a plan? Uh, there's an old saying to plan, or excuse me, there's an old saying that to fail to plan is to plan to fail. Now, that's attributed to Ben Franklin. I assume that's correct, but the saying has been attributed to him. So let me ask you what your plan is. All right, what's your plan for life? Proverbs has a passage regarding planning. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9 says, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord determines his step." So uh, we make plans, and we determine where we want to go, what we want to do, and we make these long range plans and short term plans and all these kinds of things. But what Scripture says is that a man may plan his way, he may determine where he wants to go, what that goal is, but the Lord determines his steps. So you identify what you desire and where you want to go, but in the end, the Lord actually determines how you get there and the steps you take. All right. So, in some ways, I can tell you that's comforting to me. I hope it is to you. If it's not, that's what we want to talk about this morning. So, in this story, Paul has set his sights, his goal, his purpose in life is full obedience and absolute surrender to God and to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to proclaiming that gospel. So he wants to be absolutely obedient to God. He wants to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially in Rome. But the Lord is determining his steps, those steps that Paul would take. Now, if you'll remember, Paul's steps have been taking him on quite a journey. He spent 2 years in a dank, dreary prison cell in Caesarea. Then he spent several weeks in a tremendous and frightening storm, and now a harrowing shipwreck. And so I want you to think about that a little bit. Paul just wanted to know God. He wanted to know God fully and to be obedient to him, and yet God's journey of faith in Paul's life would take him through some steps that would challenge his or anyone's view of this being God's plan. In fact, if you view Paul's Christian life, if you view Paul's life from a human perspective, you would probably conclude that God was nowhere to be found. I mean, surely God wouldn't treat one of his own faithful, obedient servants the way Paul was being treated. And the fact is if you thought that, you'd be wrong. And so I want you to understand that we often view our own lives from a human perspective. And when we do so, we misunderstand or we overlook God's ordering of our steps. So when you find yourself in a personal storm and see things begin to fall apart, a bit like Paul did, don't you often stop and begin to question and wonder what's going on and why is God allowing this to happen in your life? I know I do. And I know that that there are times when things get difficult and things get challenging, and it feels like things are, well, like we're headed for a shipwreck. And we begin to cry out. We begin to ask God, where are you? Why? Why are these things happening? And maybe, in fact, maybe even your current circumstances, maybe our current circumstances are causing you to stop and question where God is, God's love. Why is this happening? What's going on? And so I want us to spend some time this morning considering uh, Paul's circumstances and God's purpose in his life and see if there might be some lessons for us in this, all right? Because I think we can find some very clear parallels here and some things that we can learn. So let's take a look at this, all right? So first, I want you to notice that they had a plan to beach the ship. Now they're sitting on this, they're on this vessel. They realized they were drawing close to shore. I mentioned that last week. These sailors now, how can a sailor tell when they're getting close to shore? My hearing is bad, but the fact is these sailors probably can hear the breakers. They can probably hear the waves. All right, and as they hear the waves crashing, as they hear the breakers, then they realize the water is getting shallower. They're beginning to get close to land. And remember, they took a sounding. We talked about what a sounding was. They took a sounding and they realized that they had gone from 120 feet or 20 fathoms to 100 to 90 feet. So they were getting shallower, and so they realized they were coming near land. And so they began to plan this. They threw the anchors out. They put 4 anchors out to slow them down, to stop them. And when morning came, this is where we find ourselves. And when morning came, they found themselves looking at a shoreline. They saw land. They sighted land. They saw a beach. They didn't recognize it, but they knew that at this point their best option was to try to beach this ship. And so that's what they did. Their plan was to beach it. I'm sure the sailors all got together, the captain, the first mate, all of them got together and they discussed what the best plan was, and they determined that the best option was to cut the anchors loose, put the foresail up, and steer for the beach, beach the ship, and then they might all be saved. And so that's what they did. But I want you to notice their planning went wrong. It went tragically wrong. In fact, what happened was when they began to make for the beach, they ended up hitting a sandbar. They ended up hitting something they couldn't see. And so I want you to understand that we often look at our options. We determine what our options are, and we begin to execute them, begin to do them. We begin to make those plans, and our plans often get interrupted by hidden sandbars, hidden rocks, hidden dangers. And so when our plans fail because of these unseen circumstances, these unseen rocks or sandbars, we have to recognize that we shouldn't lose sight of the real goal. And we must not fall back into fear that God has abandoned us to the waves. Now, remember, Paul had already told the sailors, he had already told the soldiers, told Julius, the centurion, you must keep everyone on board the ship. God has promised me that they will all be safe, but they all have to stay on board the ship. And that's when they cut the dinghy or the skiff loose and let it go. And so Paul is confident that God is going to carry out his promises. So even when their plan to beach the ship fails and they hit this sandbar and the ship begins to be beaten apart by the waves, Paul hasn't lost sight of the long-term goal. Paul hasn't lost sight of the fact that God had promised that he would spare their lives. And so I want you to catch that. I want you to understand that. We need to hear that same lesson. It's easy to lose heart in the midst of a struggle when our plans seem to go wrong. So Paul knew that though the rocks were unseen and God's purpose would not be thwarted. All right. So they had hit the sandbar. They had the ship had wrecked. They were being beaten apart by the waves, but Paul did not lose heart. God's promise still held true. So I want you to catch that. I want you to understand that. All right. So, each of these sailors probably surveyed the situation and probably agreed that that the beaching the ship was the best option, was the best thing they could do, but they didn't see the sandbar, and at that point, when it hit the sandbar and it began to be torn apart by the waves, I imagine they began to question themselves. They began to question whether that was the best plan, whether that was what they should have done. And we do the same thing. We make plans and we begin to try to live these plans out, and we hit a sandbar, we hit a snag, we hit a rock, and things begin to fall apart, and we begin to second guess ourselves. So I want us to think about that. All right. So I've got a question for you. All right. The question is, has your relationship, all right, has your relationship with God impacted how you view this crisis? Okay, think about that. God is still in control. All right, uh, God is still in control, and even if we don't get the results from our plan that we desire and expect, will we trust Him? All right. So I want you to think about this next question. The soldiers, all right, the soldiers knew that if any of the prisoners escaped, think about this. If any of the prisoners escaped, the soldiers would lose their own life for the sake of the lost prisoner. In other words, they were being held personally liable for the deliverance of these prisoners to Rome. If one of the prisoners escaped, the soldiers would end up losing their life because of that. And so when the shipwreck occurred, then they began to rethink this whole decision. You know, they kept Paul alive. They wanted to save Julius, wanted to save him, and so as the ship begins to be beaten apart, the soldiers begin to decide, we've got to act. We've got to take the lives. We've got to kill the prisoners, or else we're going to be held liable for them. All right. So they wanted to cut their losses, kill the prisoners, and hopefully save themselves. But notice this: Julius, the centurion, intercepted and redirected their plans. Why would he do that? I mean, he's going to ultimately be held accountable. Why would he stop them from killing the prisoners? Why would he stop the soldiers from killing the prisoners if he knew he would be held personally liable if any of them escaped? I think there's only one answer, and that is he has been impacted significantly by the demeanor and the character and the person and the spirit of Paul. Okay, so Paul has had a profound impact on Julius and his thinking and his actions. Okay, so I asked that question, but I want to rephrase it. Let me ask it differently. Has your relationship with Jesus had an effect on anyone in this crisis that we're in? Think about that. Julius has been impacted because of the witness of the words, of the demeanor, of the spirit of Paul. They're in the midst of probably one of the darkest moments of their lives. They're facing death. Okay, and Julius knows that if any of these prisoners escape, he will end up losing his life. And yet, Paul has so impacted him that Julius says, no, don't kill the prisoners. We need to keep them alive. Everything is going to be okay. And so I want you to think about that. All right. Before you answer the question, has your relationship with Jesus had an effect on anyone in this crisis? Before you answer that, I want you to notice I didn't ask whether that was a positive effect or a negative effect on them. All right, so consider your response. Think about that. So here's what I want you to think about. As believers, we should be so compelled, so empowered, so moved by the power, the presence, and the authority of God and His Spirit in our lives that we should have transformed thinking and Christ-like actions. All right, our thinking, the way we think, what we think, how we think, all of those things should be transformed, and our actions should be transformed. Now, here's the thing: most of the time, when we talk about being a Christian, what we talk about, and we do this, all right, it's really bad. We do this. We tend to talk about being a Christian as if it's only moral choices, and it's not. All right, moral choices certainly come into play. All right, I don't want you to think that it doesn't come into play, but it does. But it's not just about making moral choices. You make moral choices based on how you think. All right. So when you think about something, you decide what is the best option, what is the most important option, what's the most productive option, what will I get out of it? All of those things come into play. So when Christ becomes Lord of your life, it begins to change how you think. All right. And so as it changes how you think, it changes how you respond. It changes how you act. It changes how you react. And so I want you to think, and I want you to think about that we must be empowered by the presence and the authority of God and His Spirit and His Word, so that we begin to think and act differently regardless of the circumstances. That's the key. All right. Catch that. Not just think and act differently when things are going well. Think and act differently even when things are going badly. You see, in the midst of this storm, in the midst of this shipwreck, Paul has been a positive influence, and Julius is being impacted, and Julius is beginning to make different choices based on the influence that Paul has had. So that's why I asked that question. Have you had an impact on anyone in the midst of this crisis? All right. So if you're unsure about whether that's, go back and think about it. Go back and think about the last few weeks. I mean, I realized this morning as I took a look at this, this is our 8th online broadcast. All right. So we've been doing this for 8 weeks now. It's been a challenge. It's been different, but it's still been good. But I want you to think about that. Has your life been an influence on somebody in a positive way? Now, I didn't ask whether it's positive or negative. I want it to be positive. I suspect some of us have had negative impact. I'm sure I have in some way. But have we had a positive impact on someone for the sake of Christ over the last 8 weeks or the last 10 weeks? All right. So I want you to think about that. So, another question for you. All right. So, this one's even more serious. Think about this. Is our current situation and our personal and church response a hindrance to the work of God's Spirit, or an opportunity for God's Spirit to be displayed through us? All right. So think about that. Is, all right, is this an opportunity? All right. An opportunity. All right. Let me throw this up. Is your response or our response to this crisis an opportunity for God to display His power, or is it a hindrance to God displaying His power? You say it's entirely dependent on you. It depends on how you respond. All right. Now, I said we were going to talk about shipwreck. You could certainly classify what's happened in our lives a bit of a shipwreck. And as this has happened, the question is, have we let the Spirit of Christ so impact us, influence our thinking, influence our actions, so that we are having an impact on those around us? All right. So that question, let me throw it back up. I want you to think about this. Is your response to this crisis an opportunity for God to display His power, or a hindrance to God displaying His power? It ought to be an opportunity. It ought to be an opportunity for God to display His power through you in the midst of this crisis. All right? If Jesus is truly transforming your life through the power and the presence of His Spirit in you, then you should be having a positive influence on those around you. All right? We should be compelled by the Spirit of God. Now, I want to tell you, if you think, okay, so I mean, how in the world is that going to happen? Go read. I want you to I'm going to tell you, go take a look at Romans chapter 8 and Romans chapter 12. In fact, you could actually look at Romans 8, 10, 11, and 12. But go read. All right, go take a look at Romans. We're actually, I'm gonna kind of lay my hand out. We're almost to the end of Acts. My plan is to go into Romans next. All right, so that's where we're headed. But I want you to take a look at that. Go see Romans chapter 8 and chapter 12 specifically. In chapter 8, Paul says, this is what the Spirit is doing in your life. And a part of that is he's making you into the image of Christ, regardless of the circumstances. And then in chapter 12, he says, are you willing to put your life on the altar as a living sacrifice to him and to have your thinking transformed, to begin to be a different person? And as your thinking is transformed, then it begins to transform your actions. And that's actually what the rest of chapter 12, 13, 14, and 15 are about. So I want you to think about that, all right? Are we committed, all right? Are we committed to Jesus impacting our communities, the people around us, our neighbors, our friends, our family, through our relationship with Christ? If that's not true for you, then what's your plan? You see, that's where we started. Your plan is, where am I headed? What am I doing? All right. So I want you to think about that. Paul was committed to God's plan. Okay. He was committed to God using his circumstances to display God's power and God's authority to a Roman centurion. And Paul was willing for God to do whatever needed to be done in his life to have that impact. All right, so I want to ask you, are we willing to be obedient to God and to let God demonstrate a Christ like spirit and godly actions to our neighbors, to our community, to the people, well, even to your family in these difficult times? All right, so Paul was committed to that. He was going to stay obedient to God regardless of where it might take him and what he might have to endure. In other words, Paul trusted God more than he feared the things that were coming up. Okay? So let me throw this up here. Do you trust God more than you fear the steps in the journey? Think about that. All right? Because if you knew that this pandemic was going to happen, I mean, if we go back and look, we began to see cases in China. We most of us didn't know about it until about January. I began to see it and notice it and watch it in January. But cases began to occur. Now they think even a little earlier than December, but at least in mid-December in China. And as that began to happen, we began to pay attention to this thing and began to watch it. And then we began to see cases in the United States. And in January, I think we were just hopeful it would go away. By February, we began to be really concerned. By the end of February, we really began to watch it. And then in early March, it was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? All right. So let me ask you a question. If you had known that this pandemic was coming, would you have been willing to say to God, whatever you want to do, I'm your servant. I'm willing to do whatever you ask. I'm willing to go wherever you want me to go, endure whatever you want me to endure, so that your power can be displayed and your word can be magnified and you can be glorified. You see, that's exactly what Paul's commitment was. Paul was committed to obedience to God and for God's glory, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what he might have to endure. Are you able to see through the storm and see the outcome, to see where God is headed? You see, that's the key. All right, to be able to see past the storm and to see where God is taking us. All right, so in spite of the waves, all right, in spite of the shipwreck, even though we know it's coming, are we willing to trust God in the midst of us? Okay, now I will tell you, for some of us, this seems more plausible than it does for others. We might want to blame our doubts on our circumstances. All right. We want to say, well, if God would just do something different, if it didn't go this way, if this didn't happen, that I could trust God. If this didn't happen, then I'd believe, or I'd be willing to follow God wherever. Let me tell you something. Circumstances don't determine your faith. All right. Circumstances may cause us, or we want to blame our doubts on circumstances. But doubts arise not from circumstances, they arise from misunderstanding God's character and God's plan. Okay? Notice, Paul knew the wreck was coming. He knew that the shipwreck was going to happen. But he was able to see beyond the shipwreck to say, I trust God. Are you able to see past your circumstances to say, I trust God more than I fear the steps in the journey? Okay, here's the question again. Do you trust God more than you fear the steps in the journey? All right. So are you willing to allow God to begin to take that fear, those doubts, and to resolve them in your life? All right. Because if you begin to view your life from God's perspective, if you begin to view your circumstances from God's perspective, then you're not looking at the situation, you're not looking at the circumstances, you're looking at the goal. You're looking at the long-term goal. All right. And the long-term goal has never wavered if you're a believer. All right. If we mistakenly view personal success, now listen to me, if we mistakenly view personal success as a sign of God's favor, as a sign of God's blessings and God's approval, then that will lead to doubt and disobedience when those things fall away. And they do, inevitably. All right? We all go through periods of struggle. We all have things break. We all have shipwrecks in our lives. If we view the shipwreck as an abandonment of God, we've misunderstood the circumstance. All right. Now, some of you may be struggling with various things in your life. Maybe you're struggling with a circumstance right now that you look at it and go, why, God? I can't answer the why, but I can tell you God is still faithful. God is still there. God still loves you. He's using the circumstances to shape you. All right. He used these circumstances to shape Paul, to get him ready for what he was going to do, how he was going to use him in the days ahead. So you face circumstances in your own life, and I don't know what they are. They may have nothing to do with COVID-19. They may have to do with something entirely different. But the fact is if you're willing to understand that the circumstances are not the fulfillment of God's promise, they're the steps, then you can trust God to get you past this sandbar, to get you past this shipwreck. All right, because your focus is not on this, it's on Him. All right, so I want you to focus on that. So it's important that you see, all right, hear me. It's important that you see that God's purpose for Paul was the dominant factor in Paul's circumstances. Let me restate that. I want you to hear it. God's purpose for Paul was the dominant factor in Paul's circumstances. If Paul had viewed his circumstances the way we often view our own, then Paul would have questioned and doubted God too. Seriously. If Paul viewed his circumstances the way we do, he would have looked at the shipwreck and went, what's going on? Why is this happening? And yet, what he did was he kept looking to God. He kept trusting Him. So are we willing to continue to look to God and to trust Him in the midst of these circumstances? All right. So instead, Paul saw his circumstances as the process by which God would achieve His purpose, would bring glory to His own name, and would develop Paul into this obedient servant that God desired. That's what God wanted. God wanted Paul to be an obedient servant of His. And by the way, that's what He wants of you. Yes. I want you to hear that. That's what he wants of you. All right. So here's the final question of the week. What do you want, or what do you see as God's ultimate purpose for your life? Okay. What do you see as God's ultimate purpose for your life? I want you to see this. Purpose, the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists. Why were you created? Why do you exist? All right. And so I want you to understand, you don't exist. You weren't created for your own benefit and your own good. Now, I can tell you that a lot of people, their ultimate purpose in life is financial success or to be independently wealthy. I'm serious. All right. And I know many of you are thinking, well, I wish I could be, right? So much I could do if God would just make me wealthy. And let me break some news to you. If God trusted you with that, you would already have it, and you would already be an instrument in his hand for that purpose. Obviously, he doesn't trust me that way, and that's why I don't have that, and that may be why you don't have it. All right. But that's not our goal. My goal should not be to be to be financially successful or independently wealthy. My goal must be to be the servant God wants me to be. All right. Now, um, I doubt that that's God's goal. God's goal is not to make you independently wealthy or financially successful. By the way, he also doesn't want to make you a YouTube star. He doesn't want you to have to be an ultimate influencer on Twitter or TikTok or Snapchat or whatever. That's not God's goal for your life. Seriously, that is not God's goal for your life. God's goal for your life is to bring you to faith in him, and then to emulate Christ in your thoughts and your actions, and to point others to faith. That is God's purpose and goal for you. All right? That means that, and I know some of you, that's what you want to be. All right? Some of you are still off wanting to be an ultimate influencer. All right? You still want to have all these fans on Twitter or Facebook or TikTok or whatever, that Snapchat. But let me tell you something. If you really want to know God, then your goal must be to know him and to obey him. And when that begins to happen, when that begins to change your focus, all right, then it begins to change the steps that God orders. Now, here's the tough part. Paul wanted to be obedient to God and used by him. Did you see where that took him? I told you, it's tough. So understand that this is not easy. It's not, I want to follow God, so therefore the path must be really easy to do. No, it's not. It is extremely difficult. One of the reasons it's so difficult is because there's so much in us that doesn't look like God. There's so much in us that doesn't resemble Christ. That's why those steps are so hard. That's why those steps are so difficult. So I want you to understand that your steps might resemble Paul's too. Okay, there may be some shipwrecks, there may be some struggles, there may be some difficult times, but I want you to know that if what you want is God, all right, then he will begin to work those steps in your life. Okay. By the way, if we wanted those other things, we wouldn't bring glory to God. We'd be distracted by our desires. All right. So God minimizes those distractions and tries to get us focused on those things that are really important in life. Okay. He minimizes the distractions. That's his goal, to minimize the distractions, keep us focused on him, keep us walking on that path with him. And that's what he's doing in the midst of this current crisis. I want you to hear that. That is what he's doing in the midst of this crisis. I asked you a question earlier. Is God being, are you affecting someone else's life positively in the midst of this? You see, I don't think that this crisis is intended to distract the church. I think this crisis is intended to focus the church. It's intended to get us off the distractions. It's intended to get us away from the distractions. and to get us focused on the church. God's not trying to frustrate us. He's trying to get us focused. All right? Focused on his purpose, not ours. So let me end with this question. What do you see as God's ultimate purpose for your life? How you answer that question will determine your goal, and then your goal will determine the steps that God orders. Seriously, think about that. What's your purpose? All right. What do you see as the ultimate purpose of your life? Whatever that purpose is, whatever that goal is, all right, that's going to order your steps. If you want to be an obedient servant of God's, then he's going to order those steps to make that happen. It may take you through some difficult times. It may take you through some shipwrecks. It might throw you into some deep waters. But ultimately, God will be glorified and you will reach that goal. So, I want to encourage you this morning. If you don't know Christ, you can trust him this morning. If you don't know Christ, I want you to comment on this post. I want you to go to our website, hilltopshawnee.com. Send me a prayer request. Go to the prayer request page. Send me a prayer request. I get a text when you do that. I can communicate back with you, all right, via email or whatever. I want to talk with you. So if you don't know Christ, you can. If he's not your ultimate purpose, he should be. And then he will begin to order your steps, and you will begin to be transformed in your thinking and in your actions to emulate him. My prayer for you today is that you will know him, and that you will honor him, and that you will obey him, and he will order your steps. So let all those distractions fall aside. Follow him. Obey him. God bless each one of you.